Well, we're in the book of Isaiah in chapter 40 today. Isaiah is really three parts. You've got chapters 1 through 36, that's a section. Then 37 through 39 is kind of a historical section there. And then beginning in chapter 40, you have more of an advanced feature, a foretelling of restoration and things to come, and a lot of messianic verses. And as we go forward, a lot of people compare the book of Isaiah with almost like a microcosm of the Bible. There's 66 chapters in Isaiah, same as the Bible. Chapters 40 through 66 parallel with the 26 chapters that are in 27, I guess, 26 or 7 there in the New Testament. Then you have the previous section, it's parallels with the Old Testament, and so we see this. But Isaiah has warned the nation in chapters 1 through 39 that they're going to go through some excruciating pain, and Jerusalem is going to be destroyed. The city's inhabitants are going to be stripped of their possessions. Most all the able-bodied and skilled people are going to be dragged away, and they're going to spend 70 years of exile in Babylon. And this disaster did occur in 586 BC. But again, in chapters 40 through 66, Isaiah foresees a time of restoration for his people. God would forgive their sins. He would provide a way from them to return to the promised land. So Isaiah then, he continues to point even further into the future, past the restoration of Jerusalem to an even greater deliverance, and that deliverance would be carried out by Jesus Christ, the Messiah. So we look today, our whole background material is taken from chapters 40 and 41, and just kind of give you kind of an overview here. Isaiah begins chapter 40 encouraging the people about the Lord's new message. And he uses the imagery of a messenger crying out to prepare the way of the Lord. He called for his people to make a highway for his turn. In other words, make a smooth place, it says. And Isaiah announced the coming day when the heralds of Jerusalem would proclaim God's renewed favor on his people. So he says this would be announced. Isaiah then described a vast and majestic nature. And he talks about how nature would declare this restoration. So it goes beyond people. Isaiah then, in the latter part of chapter 40, he contrasts God's power with the emptiness of believing in idols. And Isaiah had insisted that no equal anywhere in verses 25 and 26 of chapter 40. So Isaiah uses these truths to encourage God's people here, and he says to them, you have to understand, y'all know, God is creator. God never grows tired or weary. And then he calls again upon nature. He called upon the coastlines and to celebrate this return. He also highlights the fact that those who oppose God would be put to shame and disgrace. He then in chapter 41, he talks about the agricultural blessings that would come to the promised land, this restored promised land. And then he gets to what we look at today. He presents his case against false gods or idols. And he challenged them so that they would realize that idols had no real power. And we think about, just in these short chapters that we've studied here, we've seen Isaiah foretell that the northern tribe of Israel would fall. Well, they did, 722. We saw that the southern kingdom of Babylon would fall in 586. It happened. He says that the Assyrians, who were all powerful, and they had dominated that region for 100, 150 years, they would be overthrown by the Babylonians. History documents that. That happened. Then Cyrus, who was a Persian, he came in and he overthrew the Babylonians. And so as we look at our lesson text today, we can see history unfold here, just as Isaiah had foretold it, just as Daniel had foretold it. But we have a verse today that talks about princes and kings being uprooted. And we see how dramatic and how much in control God is when it comes to leaders. You know, we had at this time Hezekiah, who was king of Jerusalem. He's there under assault from the Assyrians, Sennacherib, and Sennacherib was overthrown by the Babylonians, and the Babylonians are overthrown by the Medes and the Persians. And so, you know, we just see step by step as we look through how God facilitates history here. So, specifically today, we're in Isaiah chapter 40, and we'll begin in verses 18 through 20 here. In verse 18, with whom will you compare God? What likeness will you set up for comparison with him? So, as he speaks to the people, he wants to delineate between God and what man-made idols were. And he describes God's power, God's sovereignty, God's understanding in verse 18. And then he turns his attention to describing just the powerlessness, these substitutes that people often try to put in God's place. You know, we think today, not many of us have carved images in our homes or in our life. But yet again, there's so many things that get in the way of God, you know. And these things are, they're real. Mostly what I see today, we can see money, we see power, we see fame and fortune and prestige, we see politics. We see a lot of things that can usurp God. I think in my lifetime, and I've mentioned this to you, the thing that I see that takes people away from God, one of the number one things, is the way we manage our time. There basically is not any quiet time left, you know, for an individual anymore. Everybody's extremely busy, and we're bombarded all day long with news, and when we're not watching the news or reading the paper, you know, it's emails and text messages and Twitter this and, you know, Snapchat that and all this. So there's not a lot of room anymore in a person's life for time. If we don't have time, if we don't have free time, we absolutely will not have time for God. And, you know, that's one of the things that I see in a modern world that we're void of, you know, is time. And so Satan has used a modern convenience such as email or text messaging or something else to basically involve most all of everybody's time today. And we don't have the time to spend with God. And it's real important. And you take, this is a new thing in history. This has never happened to where constantly something is encroaching upon your intellect, your thought process, all day long, you know, it goes on. This constant communication, constant attempts to have you to engage with everything in life out here. You know, for all of society, people, you know, had free time. we really worked around daylight and dark. And at nighttime, you had lots of free time, you know, because you just couldn't go and do the things we do today. And there wasn't access to it. But today, you know, it never stops. It just goes on and on. So he asked about gods here. He wants them to know, he wants them to compare, who will you compare with God? And what likeness will you set up for him for comparison? And what foreign king is going to create and sustain the universe here? I mean, simply put. So, you know, none. You know, what empire could guarantee its own rise and fall? None. You know, we, the United States, do. We call ourselves a nation under God. I question that nowadays, and it looks like that we're definitely not under God's control anymore. And we wonder, why would we expect that we're a permanent fixture in history when we deny the one who put us here to start with, you know? So, a real question. He asked about the likeness that you'll set up for comparison. You think about this. What did God say in the Garden of Eden? He says, let us make man in our image according to our likeness. So why does man turn around then and try to make an image that in his mind is a God? You know, when they were in the wilderness, they made a statue of a bull, you know. And you have gods today, and they have animal heads on them or wings on them, and all through pagan history, you know, they would have figures that would be part man, part God. And you think about how ludicrous is it to think that God created man, it says, in our image. That's how he put it in Genesis. Why does man turn around and try to make an image that's comparable to God, but really, that's really a deviant form of who God is? God not only said, we'll make man in our image, when he got through, he declared creation good. But when he created man, he said, he described him as very good. That's how God described it. So, you know, we're in some thin air where we are. We're in territory as God's created in his likeness. This is very, very rare air that we're in. And he took that time and that consideration to make us in his image. That's why that people, individuals, are so valuable to God. Very valuable to God. And he didn't make that distinction for the animal world and the created world out here then. So we think about how silly is it for mankind to try to create something that improves upon what God declared as very good. We want to always think about that. Look in verse 19, he says, an idol, he asked the question, something that a smelter cast and a metalworker placed with gold and make silver chains for. Look, Isaiah particularly wanted to confront the spiritual blindness of idols. Now these are physical idols. You know, I always think about, was it Jacob's wife, Rachel, who stole all the family idols and put them in the saddlebags, you know, and her brother came to her father, somebody, but she carried the idols with her back to the promised land, you know, from where they were traveling to. And but God specifically prohibited the worship of idols. And in the second commandment, thou shalt have no other gods before me, you know. And then he says, thou shalt not create a graven image. And so the Old Testament reveals that the Israelites continually struggled with this temptation. You can look in 2 Kings in chapter 17. And this was one of the downfalls of the northern kingdom. But they would erect idols on what they call the high places. And they would have hills and overlooks and things that, you know, had a panoramic view. And they would construct idols there. And Hezekiah's son, you know, Hezekiah was in the Bible records as being a good king. But his son Manasseh, he introduced vile paganism and idolatry into Judah. I mean, he was a wicked man, and wicked. So Isaiah describes an idol here in three ways. The first, he said, it was something that a smelter cast. King James says a craftsman, but anyway, the second description, he says, something a metal worker placed with gold. Normally, idols would have been carved from wood, and they'd overlay it with gold, gold leaf. And the third thing he said, something that a metal worker adorns with silver chains. So the presence of silver chains, it was an adornment. It was like jewelry, Well, we're going to make this idol really look special, We're going to put something on it. And but the bottom line of it is, regardless how elaborate and how beautiful, idols were merely human creations. They were just an idea of a man, a skilled person who could do things. And we see beautiful things that people make. They do wonderful artwork. They do all this, but mankind cannot create mankind, and that's what God did. And that's the distinction here. Look what he says now in verse 20. A poor person contributes wood for a pedestal that will not rot. He looks for a skilled craftsman to set up an idol that will not fall over. Well, he talks about people who couldn't afford silver or gold here. So they get a choice piece of wood, and they want it to be enduring. So they would get a piece of wood that wouldn't rot. I don't know in Israel what type of wood that would be. We have wood here that's a lot more durable. When I was a boy, if you wanted a fence post that would last 100 years, you cut down a catalpa tree, And there are posts put in the ground in the 1800s that are still here that are made out of catalpa, They won't rot. And it's a real unusual type wood. We know them as catalpa trees here, but it's catalpa, and got the long beams on it. And then locust, they would make fence posts out of locust trees, and so we have woods here. So one thing that even a poor person could do, he could get a piece of wood that was enduring. And the second thing is, he wanted to build it and have a craftsman to fashion it where it wouldn't tumble over. And if the idol ever fell over, it was viewed that it had lost its power. Do you remember when the idol Dagon, and when the Philistines took the Ark of the Covenant and they carried it in and they brought it into their country, and they kept their idol? The first time Dagon fell over, that was in their temple, and the second time they set him up and he fell over and crushed all the pieces here then. And it was just a sign then, that their God didn't have any power. I think that's
couldn't stand before the real God.
That's right, exactly. It's a good way of saying it there. That's a better way of saying it. And they decided then that they didn't really need that ark after all, and so that's when they put it on what they call the milch cow, and they sent the cow with the cart back, and it went back to Israel, and it hadn't helped them. Are there any thoughts or questions up to now? Verse 21. Do you not know? Have you not heard? Has it not been declared to you from the beginning? Have you not considered the foundations of the earth? So Isaiah challenges now his audience with 4 rhetorical questions here. He first asks, do you not know? So he challenges the people to admit that they knew or should have known the truth about God and about the lies of idolatry. After all, they were descendants of Abraham. They were recipients of the law. They had the priesthood. They should know these things. These are things. Today in our world, an awareness and knowledge of God is not preventing anybody in our country from coming to God. Every street corner in the U.S. has got a church on it. There's daily stuff, TV shows, and just mail that comes in all the time. But Christ is being proclaimed here in our country. Do we not know? Well, apparently we don't. You know, the nation as a whole is oblivious to who God is now. Second question he asked, have you not heard? So you think about it. All of the leaders, the priests, the prophets, they were there to teach God's truth, to confront their sins, to call them to repentance and faith. And again, we just emphasize this. We're not short of having God communicating to us in any way. We're not short of that. The third thing, he said, has it not been declared to you from the beginning? Well, the covenant and the requirements of exclusive loyalty to the Lord, it was neither new or it was not different from what Abraham or Moses or David or anybody had been exposed to here then. He says from the beginning. So God had revealed his power and his righteousness in the Garden of Eden, and from that moment on. The fourth question he asked, have you not considered the foundations of the earth? So God's majesty goes back in time as far as the world's creation. And the earth, you know, the earth itself is an obvious witness of who God is. And, you know, just his creation itself here. We read many times the oft-repeated psalm. Psalms 19, he says, the heavens are telling of the glory of God, and their expanse is declaring the work of his hands. Day to day pours forth speech. In other words, day to day, when we look around, we see God's communicating to us his creation. And night to night reveals knowledge. We see how all the order and the systems are in place here. There is no speech, nor are there words. Their voice is not heard. So they don't audibly speak to us. But look what he says in 4. Their line has gone out through all the earth, and their utterances to the end of the world. In them he has placed a tent for the sun. He goes on. You know, they're not saying anything audible, but when you look back, a reasonably minded person can look at the created order here and realize, you know, who and what God is. So we see then that the earth itself is just an obvious witness to what's going on. In verse 22, he continues with this description. He says, God is enthroned above the circle of the earth. Its inhabitants are like grasshoppers. He stretches out the heavens like thin cloth and spreads them out like a tent to live in. So Isaiah, he proclaims here that God is enthroned above the earth. He's above all this. He's superior to all this. He's overseer and manager of all this. It depicts a sovereign Lord as existing here above the circle of the earth. So to liken him to an idol is nonsense. It's utter nonsense here. So in contrast to God, we see the earth's inhabitants are like grasshoppers, he said. Now, I mentioned earlier that we're very important to God. We're very significant to God. But what he's trying to do here is make a delineation here between the Creator and the created. You know, we're like grasshoppers in relation to God. He said God stretches out the heavens like a thin cloth. So the imagery here depicts God's skill as he created and sustained his universe. Something that idols were powerless to do. So the statement that God spreads the heavens and makes them like a tent to live in, it further enhances this imagery. You know, God is above and he's removed from this. He's superior to this. Any thoughts now? In verse 23, he said, he reduces princes to nothing and makes judges of the earth like a wasteland. So, having liking human beings their power to being like grasshoppers, he then emphasized God's sovereignty over human leaders. First, he said the Lord reduces princes to nothing. And you know, princes, kings, rulers, they would have enjoyed an elevated status based on human criteria. But he said that God makes judges of the earth like a wasteland. People who judge, they carry with them a position of certain authority. All of our leaders have some degree of authority granted, you know, to them. But, however, this standing did not rival the Lord's power. We just talked about, you know, all the kings in Isaiah's time. Hezekiah is going to be gone. Sennacherib is going to be gone. Nebuchadnezzar is going to be gone. Cyrus the Great is going to be gone. And they're going to come and go. And we see this. In 24, look what he said. They are barely planted, barely sown. Their stem hardly takes root in the ground when he blows on them and they wither. And a whirlwind carries them away like stubble. So Isaiah stressed the fleeting nature of human kingdoms. He said they're barely planted and barely sown. Their stem hardly takes root. So when we compare humanity then to the Lord's eternal reign as king, human rulers, earthly reigns, they come and go in the blink of an eye. And we sometimes don't think about this, but we live in a small town, a small community, and I think about all the names that were here, you know, when I came here. You know, there were Daggetts, there were McClendons, there were Markhams, there were Benhams, there were Manns, there were Millers. You know what?
All gone.
All gone. In a pretty short while. And you know, on and on. There was named Newburns and people like this, and they were very profound people. And they're all gone. And so we can see what this verse says, you know. He said the words, he blows on them and they wither. It further describes just the ease with which God could end a ruler's reign or even an individual's life. And we've mentioned, you know, in history there how categorically he removed big, extremely powerful kings, you know, in the Middle East over there.
Well, and there's even in our own country right now, the remembrance of values that as short a time ago as 40 years, 50 years, are, you have to fight. You have to fight somebody to say that you don't, that you might have to have some morals.
Yeah.
You don't, I mean, physically fight, but it's just what is actually right or wrong is not what people thought just a short time ago.
Well, a lot of people, in regard to that, right or wrong, a lot of people, whether they want to admit it or not, but they look at what's relatively wrong, you know, for them.
Right.
And a lot of people look at situational ethics. And so what's right for you may not be right for me, you know, but we know that that's not true, that God established parameters that was right and wrong. And for thousands of years, these things were right, you know. But now all of a sudden they come into question as to why would I want to be bothered by all that, you know. I'm going to do what my conscience tells me is right.
I bet out there in society, out in the world, if you actually had the phrase, we're a Christian nation, you'd have a lot of people scratching their heads saying, I've never heard that, and what's that about? You know, and so things just seem
President Reagan, back in the early 80s, said freedom is just one generation away from evaporating.
Yeah.
But you could take freedom out of that quote and put morality or justice or even kindness, you know, and think about what has happened in this country between his time and the time we're faced with right now. his words ring really true and loud at the moment when, you know, he said that. People just kind of rolled their eyes and said, well, he's just an old guy that's kind of lost a step, that's
Yeah.
making some noise, but he was really profound in saying that.
Well, even, you know, you go back to the founding fathers of our country. These guys were political and governmental geniuses. They set up a system that had never been set up. But it's hard to read any writing by any one of them that he doesn't make a reference to God, you know. And we saw that the motivation behind everything they did, you know, was a godly driven thing. And I'm going to say that that's way down on the list today, you know, what motivates most of our leaders, you know. And it's pretty bad. But anyway, verse 25, he says, to whom will you compare me, or who is my equal? Asked the Holy One. Well, this reminds us, I went back and read in the book of Job, you know. And, you know, what's the first thing that he asked? You know, where were you when I stretched the line? Where were you when I set the bases, the foundations of the earth? You know, tell me, you know, what's the distance from here to there? And Job, who for 38 chapters now had begged God to come, I want to have an audience with you. I'm ready to debate this and show you how right I am. But when God showed up, you know what? Job immediately realized, look, I'm in a bad spot here, and I don't need to be here, you know. What does he say? He said, I relent, said I cover my mouth, and I relent, and he said I can't speak, you know. And he knew that he was outclassed here, then he couldn't say anything. But this is exactly what he says here. You know, this is similar to verse 18, except here the Lord asks similar questions, but he asks it in first person. You know, whom will you compare me? Who is my equal? And of course they're rhetorical questions. They anticipate a response of nothing or no one here. No human ruler begins to compare with the Lord. Isaiah's favorite name here, he uses the Holy One. A lot of times he would say Holy One of Israel. But when we say holy, holy basically means to be separate. It means to be distinct, you know. It describes God's separateness, you know, and his incomparable majesty and this unique nature that he has. So he says, look up and see, who created these? He brings out the stars by number. He calls all of them by names. Because of his great power and strength, not one of them is missing. So Isaiah then makes a reference to nature. And remember, he's talking to people who are idol worshipers, who want to have confidence in a foreign king, who want to make alliances with pagans. And he asks them, look up and see. Think about this awesome splendor. What we read in Psalms 19 earlier. Who created this vast array of celestial bodies? And he pointed it out in three ways, you know. He controls the stars. He says that he brings them out by number. You know, you think about it, he created the process by which all the stars, you know, they're unseen. If you look out this window in the sky today, we don't see stars. But you know what? They're still there. They're there just like they were at nighttime, but we can't see them. Well, you know, to me, that's just almost like a minor miracle. How is it that everything is in place, but today it's obscure to us? Tonight it's going to show back up again. And he says, second thing, he said, God calls all of them by name. Even in biblical times, there were names for certain constellations. You know, there was Orion, there was Pleiades and Pleiades or whatever it is. But they had these constellations. And what it means here is, in a Mideastern culture, when you named something, it meant that you had authority over them, you had privilege over them. And so they would name people, towns, locations, and it was significant because that meant that you were over that. Well, that's what he's saying here. God is over the stars. He's able to name them, you know. And a third thing, he said he also sustains their existence because of his great power and strength. He said not one of them is missing. So isn't it miraculous that today we see the most powerful star that we have, which is the sun. But tonight, you know, it'll go away and we'll see the lesser stars. My wife reminded me last night, she says, you know, we're having a blue moon. And a blue moon that's when you have 2 full moons in 1 month. And that's a very rare occasion, you know. But last night, I've been seeing the full, you know, basically the full moon for about 3 days in a row now when I got up in the mornings. It's been bright and beautiful and just really lovely, you know. But for someone like me who's up early every day and out on the farm at daylight, it's hard not to be aware, you know, of what God's doing out here just from a standpoint of nature. And I look at it, not only that He created it, but also look, just the consistency and how the structure that we have in life, you know. We're going to have day to day, we're going to have night to night, we're going to have seasons, we're going to have hot and cold, we're going to have rain and dry, but we're going to see this structure that God put in place here. It's been going on for thousands of years now. And you have to think that, look, this isn't happenstance now. There's purpose and reason in behind all this. In verses 27 through 31, he's telling the people you're going to live in captives for about 70 years. And so to encourage them, he proclaims now that God is not going to grow weary. So he says in 27, Jacob, why do you say, and Israel, why do you assert? My way is hidden from the Lord, and my claim is ignored by God. So Isaiah anticipates now 2 complaints that the nation would have that they'd be tempted to voice when they had these spiritual struggles while they're in Babylon. The first one is their way was hidden from the Lord. Another way of saying that God could not see or didn't understand their situation. And then a second thing, a claim that they were being ignored by God, that God didn't care about His people's hardships and sufferings. And I would tell you this, that everybody in this room has had a day like that. And you wonder, God, where are you? Aren't you aware of what I'm going through? Don't you care about what's happening to me and my family here? Can't you see what's going on? And so, and I would tell you this, that moment in your life, it didn't happen, again, by happenstance or for just arbitrary. It was there for a purpose. God wanted you to ask that question. God wants to answer that question. God does know about our suffering. He does know about our hardship. Look in verse 28. Do you not know? Have you not heard? The Lord is the everlasting God, the creator of the whole earth. He never becomes faint or weary. There is no limit to His understanding. Isaiah reminds God's people that the Lord is everlasting God and creator. And this reminded the Israelites that the Lord, He was not, He is not bound by human history. He's not bound by a timeline, by calendars, by seasons. Jerusalem might be destroyed. People might be taken to Babylon as captives. But this doesn't mean that the Lord was not, that He was defeated or that He was no longer in control. Further, it says He is creator of the whole earth. That meant He was over the land of Babylon, just like He was over Jerusalem and Israel. And, you know, we have to think about when we go back and look, we think about the remarkable result and remarkable people that came out of Babylon. Daniel was the first one that I think about. Ezra, you think about him. He was a scribe that went back to Jerusalem. Nehemiah, he went back and built the walls, you know. And we see this huge evidence of people who served in a pagan country under pagan kings, but yet again, they had the faith to see farther enough to know that you know, God is still in control, that He could handle this. In verse 29, He gives strength to the faint and strengthens the powerless. So instead of forsaking Israel, God could be counted on to give strength to the faint and powerless. So Romans 8 tells us that God gives us the power to live in a faith situation, whatever that situation may be. He gives us that ability here, and we know that. And in verses 30 and 31, youths may become faint and weary, and young men stumble and fall, but those who trust in the Lord will renew their strength. They will soar on wings like eagles. They will run and not become weary. They will walk and not faint. So youths, they typically would possess great energy and stamina, but yet again, their energy is not inexhaustible. And it says they could become faint and weary. Then he mentions young men. Even at the peak of their vitality, they could stumble and fall. King James says utterly fall. So Isaiah is acknowledging that God's people in situations such as the Babylonian captivity, they're going to need strength far beyond their inner resources and abilities. You know, I long for the day that I could move around like I did when I was 20 years old, you know, and and just feel as good as I used to feel, you know, and we think about that. For me, I think that's one of the benefits of heaven, you know, that I'm really looking forward to. And but what he's really saying here is, even when we're at our best, when we're young and full of youth and full of vigor, even there are certain circumstances in life that strength is not going to be enough to get you through. We have to have the inner strength that comes only from God here. He said, but those who trust in the Lord will renew their strength. And Isaiah used 3 word pictures here. He describes what this inner strength would feel like or symbolize. He said, we soar on wings like eagles. He then described, he said, we will run and not become weary. In other words, when we're advancing rapidly in life, when we're moving along. I think about, you know, younger and middle-aged couples. They're running through life right now. They're raising a family, they get married, they're buying a house, they're sending their kids to school. Look, they're running. Then I look at the third thing. God's people would walk and not faint. Well, I'm mostly walking now, you know. But I think what that means to me is just the day-to-day situations that we face as we get older. He gives us the strength not only to run and to be vigorous, but He gives us the strength on a day-to-day basis here, you know, one step at a time, one day at a time. And so we see this. So we ask ourselves in conclusion today, how does knowing that the Lord is the source, the sustainer, and He is the end point for all of human history, how does this renew your hope, you know? How does this make you hopeful of God? And another thought is, which is one area of your life that you need to trust more to God? Turn it more over to Him. What one area of your life do you need to have more dependence upon God? I'm terribly bothered about, Cheryl mentioned, just the general atmosphere of our country. The politics are sour. the news would rather report about something bad and a calamity they had good. The morality is just in the ditch. It's just, everything that we've been taught and learned to believe about is being thrown away and trashed now, you know. Every basic ethical, moral benchmark of our lives is being threatened right now. And it's very troubling to me, very troubling. But I've got to shift my focus away from what's going on in the world to think about, you know, that God is in control. I've mentioned a couple of times the parallels that Isaiah had, that he laid out for the nation of Israel, and the parallels that we face in 2020 in our country here. A lot of similarities here, a lot of similarities. So let's ask ourselves here, you know, is there an area of our life that we need to trust God in more? Knowing that He is the sustainer of all life, does this help us to motivate to get through all this? Any thoughts today? David, would you dismiss us today, please?
Dear Lord, we thank you for all that you do for us. We realize that life is not always smooth and we do have trials and tribulations. When you have these, Lord, who always look to you, never worship any other gods. Forgive us where we fail you, Lord, in Christ's name.